good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whatever it is in your time zone. Here in Vienna, where I am at the moment, it's late afternoon, it's 7 p.m. Nicholas is quite some hours behind us. I have the pleasure and the privilege to introduce Professor Nicolas P. Terry to you. Professor Terry is Hall-Render Professor of Law and Executive Director of the William S. and Christine S. Hall Center for Law and Health at Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law. And the reason why he is here is that he has been very active in his academic life, but also in his half-academic social media life when it comes to issues that are very close to the topics that are of interest to us here in this podcast and to us at the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law. I may just very briefly summarize his CV. Professor Terry has dealt mainly on health privacy, mobile health, the Internet of Things, big data, AI, and also recently, in particular, very relevant, the opioid overdose epidemic. There are very recent developments in this area that we might cover in this conversation. He has served as on the board of advisors for the non-profit organizations Privacy Rights, that I also know a little bit. And he was a member of the US Department of Health and Human Services Health IT Policy Committee's Consumer Work Group. He testified inter alia before the Congress on regulation of mobile health apps, and currently he is also serving on the Indiana University's Grand Challenges scientific leadership team, working on, again, the addiction crisis, and is the PI on addictions law and policy Grand Challenge grants. He testified in this role also inter alia before the Senate Committee on Aging. And now the things that are very close to what we are doing here. He's a permanent blogger for the Harvard Law School's Bill of Health. And he is also publishing a podcast on a weekly basis, which is called The Week in Health Law. And he is very active on Twitter. Nicolas Terry is the acronym under which you can find him on all those topics. And the very last reason, apart from all the many reasons that I mentioned already, the very last reason for inviting him, and I'm very, very happy and proud that he accepted the invitation, was the fact that Professor Terry started to teach a course now in this term on COVID law. And the interesting question then will be, what exactly is this? Is there such a thing like COVID law? And what exactly might students expect here, and what might academic staff expect from such a course? Professor Terry, thank you very much for being with us. Let me start with the most fundamental question, which is, how are you teaching at the moment? Are you teaching remotely or on site? And how do your students like the situation at the moment?
Well, like so many people, it's been the roller coaster. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, the metaphor for almost everything we've seen over the last 2 years. So last term in the fall, so August through December, I was teaching in the classroom, pre-Omicron. Our university has a vaccine mandate, and students, staff, and faculty are pretty much all vaccinated. The students wore masks. Professors were allowed to take their masks off during teaching. So last semester, I taught my Introduction to Health Law and Policy course with my students. This semester, we started back in second week of January, and I have been teaching virtually online, both my courses, health quality and safety, and also the CovidLaw course that you talk about. And we've been watching the Omicron curve very, very closely with the students. And it's my plan to be back in the classroom next week, unless we have a spike.
Okay. And students, you said, and also staff are obliged to be vaccinated. Is there anyone challenging this, or is this in agreement with everyone?
Interestingly, some of our students challenged it. And they brought suit in the federal district court in Indiana and lost there. The case went up to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, where they also lost. And that case has actually now been dismissed because the students either withdrew or graduated or whatever. But it was challenged, but it was upheld as using the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals referred to the famous US Supreme Court case of Jacobson against Massachusetts, which upheld a vaccine mandate there back in the 1900 something. And so that mandate has been upheld. Now, we live in a very conservative part of the country, and our state government is now in the process of passing a law to make vaccine mandates more difficult. So the opposite of what you should do in public health. Yeah, absolutely. And is this going to change now because of Omicron? Because one of the topics that we have in Europe at the moment is that, as you know, Omicron, or people can get infected via Omicron, although they are vaccinated. And there are quite some scholars who argue now that that might have an impact on vaccination policies and the obligation to get vaccinated. Similar debate? It's a similar debate. The United States, amongst industrialized countries, clearly is an outlier, because even though the mRNA vaccines were first available in the United States, and millions of us have been vaccinated with 1, 2, or 3 doses, we still nationally only have about 60% of the population vaccinated. That varies very much by state. So there are states in the north and the northeast, or in the northwest, that have very high vaccine rates, maybe 70 to 80%, all the way down to some of the southern states that still are in the 30 to 40% range. So we really have sort of lost the opportunity and the momentum for very high vaccination rates. So for all of the variants, from Delta to Omicron to whatever comes next, we will continue to be in danger. And both our states and some of our governors and some of our political parties are against lockdowns, mandates, and even are against masks for school children. Yeah, quite similar in Europe, I would say. And there are also quite significant differences, as you certainly know, in Europe when it comes to different states. Austria is not really in the lead here either. So we have a relatively low vaccination rate in this country also, in particular. But if you compare, for example, Denmark, that just said that they were taking all controls off, you see a very high vaccination rate there, the rest of Scandinavia. So the north and the west has a rather high rate. The south and the east has a low rate, and Austria is more in the southeast than in the northwest here when it comes to these figures. And was it you said that your university has this policy that people need to be vaccinated. Who exactly is the university there? Is it the dean who takes this decision, or is it the board of professors? We're a very large university. We are a state university. We have hundreds of thousands of students and campuses all over the state. So the decision was taken by the president of the university in conjunction with some of the folks from the medical school, the public health school, and some faculty representatives. But it was primarily an administrative decision, not a faculty decision. I see. And the decision whether you teach on campus or remotely is a decision that is taken by every professor, or is this taken by the dean, or how do you organize this? Because you said that you are expecting to go back next week. Is it you who decided this, or? So again, I go back to my roller coaster. So a year ago, the university said everyone goes online. Right. We closed the university. They locked the doors. Then this fall, they said everybody goes back. And we're all in the classroom. This semester, they have said, we think you should be back, but we will allow individual deans and departments to make some decisions and give some discretion to faculty. So it very much changes.
Yeah, and it's very similar. It's really remarkable how similar things are, although the systems are very different. But the story you're telling me is quite the same that we have all over in Europe here, right? At the beginning, everything was locked. Then they tried to open everything again, and now it's a kind of an in-between situation where more or less everyone is doing, hopefully, right things, but it's very difficult to tell what the right thing is. If you asked your students, do you think that they would prefer to be back on campus?
I haven't done a scientific poll, but my sense from my students, now remember, my students are health law students primarily, so they are very attuned to public health and vaccines and so on. My sense is that my students would prefer to stay virtual, even though they also know as social animals that they are missing out on so much about being in the building and networking and learning from each other, which I think still remains easier in person.
Yeah.
So, they are vaccinated, they look after themselves, they wear masks, the right kind of masks. But I think they would prefer to stay online a little bit.
And still they will be asked to come back, and there won't be an option for those who are afraid to come.
So what we try and do is create an option by having a Zoom option, or at the very least, we always record our classes now, so that they have the opportunity to watch the class or hear the class, and they have the slides and so on.
But you don't need to give it twice, once in class and then a second time remotely. Okay. So the workload that professors need to manage doesn't increase significantly, even if students are off-site.
That's correct. Now, I mean, I suppose that I can't answer for everybody, because different professors have different skill sets with regard to the technology and different experience with using technology. So for me, it is very easy to do online work because I've been doing it for so long. For others, it was a bit of a shock.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. But I think from my personal experience, I think there's a big difference between doing online only teaching, which is that I'm standing here and I know that the students are off-site, and I hopefully can optimize on this situation, from a situation where I have one half of the students in the room expecting me to teach there on-site just as usual, and another half being somewhere, I don't know, doing whatever in the meantime, having breakfast, watching Netflix, etc., and having me somewhere in the background, right? And this is, in my view and in my experience, rather challenging to get both groups on board.
So I think that's exactly right. We don't really have the technology to be able to conquer that at the moment. You really need very specialized rooms that people can be in, that you can really sort of, I mean, you see these in very large corporations have incredibly sophisticated rooms, remote connections, and so on, that does allow for more synthesis of the in-person experience. But when you just try and teach a class, but also have a Zoom camera there, you're absolutely correct. I agree with you. It's unsatisfactory.
Yeah. Which brings me to the other point that I mentioned before, which is that you are also doing this podcast on a very regular basis. Is this part of your teaching, or is this more like part of your scientific work, or is it more your third mission work where you communicate with other stakeholders, or can't you tell because it's all of this?
Well, I suppose, yes, it is all of it. First of all, I need, Nicholas, to confess that I have been neglecting the podcast lately. Since at the end of last year. I have been so busy with other tasks, including a new opioids a research project that we are getting ready for, that I have not been as good. So the podcast is on vacation at the moment. But yes, it started out as an excuse to work with a friend and colleague, Frank Pasquale, who's at Brooklyn Law School and an extraordinary scholar, and with interests that are similar to mine. We'd been looking for something to do together as colleagues. And so we started the podcast. And it was an amazing opportunity to every week to talk to some really smart person from within the United States or around the world. It was also a great discipline, because if I had you on my show, I would have to have read your new book or your new article and discuss it. So it was a way of disciplining oneself to read the literature and be very much up to date. It also seemed to have some impact on classes and students who seemed to enjoy them. And I've had emails from lawyers and law students and law professors from all over the world, both thanking me or criticizing me or asking why there aren't more episodes. And some of my colleagues, so a friend and colleague who is also teaching CovidLaw this year, but at another law school. He is actually using the podcast. He is assigning the podcasts to his students as readings, the podcasts that we recorded during the pandemic. So I think they are a teaching tool as well.
Yeah, and students like this. Do you know whether they like that approach, or not clear yet? Let's see.
You have to read the comments below.
Yeah, and not all of the students comment, right? And not all of them comment with their name. So yeah. So what is CovidLaw, Nicolas? What is this course? Is it? I mean, I don't know whether you know. There was. My background is very much IT law, and in IT law, as you certainly remember, there was a huge debate 25 years ago, I think, whether there is something like cyber law or IT law at all. And there was a very famous article about the law of the horse. And Lawrence Lessig then arguing that IT or cyber law is something different than the law of the horse. So I know quite well this debate, how, at least in my arena, how an academic discipline becomes an academic discipline. So is CovidLaw, in your view, becoming something like an academic discipline, something that will remain, or is this just for 1 or 2 or 3 years?
So it's too early to say. Unlike some other subjects, COVID does have a natural place in the curriculum, in the health law curriculum, because obviously a very large part of it is either health law or public health law. So these are subjects that law schools such as mine teaches on a regular basis. So COVID would have a home to go to in those traditional courses. But yes, I am well aware of Judge and Professor Easterbrook's Law of the Horse article and Larry's great riposte. I think we have learned since that debate that there are many subjects that at first sight look like they're horses. But in fact need to be treated much more seriously as standing on their own. Certainly internet law, but also my subject, health law. Health law was accused of being a horse subject early on. But clearly we have learned over the years that there are so many unique rules. I call it health law exceptionalism. There are so many unique rules in health law that we have to have our own course for it. Now, will COVID break out of being just a temporary packaging of existing issues? I think it's too early to say. I like the idea of teaching it at the moment. One, there is tremendous student enthusiasm. And you can't buy student enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Right? So if there's something that attracts them, that gets them engaged, that wants to talk about legal issues, if we package it as law of COVID and that works to bring them in, I think that's great. Secondly, rather like internet law, I think that COVID has exposed issues, exposed flaws, problems in our laws and in our understanding of the laws. It has exposed flaws in policy. And just like when we threw the internet at the legal system, things fell off and broke. And we needed to look at those and analyze them, think about them. So I think talking about COVID is a similar kind of idea that creates opportunities to look at things, from a slightly different angle or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's fun. So
yeah. So I very much like this idea that when you look at things from a COVID perspective or from an internet perspective, things start to crack in a way, and you need to look at them differently. However, if you talk to more traditional legal scholars, they would probably not agree, right? They would agree that, the typical argument they are giving at the moment, I think, at least in my environment, is, well, everyone is doing digitalization, or everyone is doing COVID law, or everyone is doing health law. So why should we name this differently and highlight this as an independent subject? And this is a very tricky part in my view, because it's right in a way, right? People do something about digitalization or health or COVID, but they don't do it systematically, and they don't do it every day, 8 hours a day. That's the only difference probably. But is that sufficient? Is that sufficient? I don't know what you would say. We don't know yet, right?
We don't know yet, and I think it's interesting if students are very good at voting with their feet. If they come to the CovidLaw class, then I think it's good.
Yeah.
I think it's an opportunity as well, not a unique opportunity, but an opportunity to task my students with tasks, deliverables that I don't usually ask for in a class. So
such as?
So here, for example, instead of writing an essay or a small article, a seminar paper on the topic, I'm asking them to write a policy brief aimed at an agency or a legislature. And I'm also asking them to come up with very specific recommendations for changes in laws or regulations to improve the area of that they're interested in. So I think that's an opportunity for me to introduce a different kind of task to the students, a task that many of my colleagues use in other contexts, but I don't use a lot. I used a similar thing with a very smart colleague that I co-taught a course on opioid law with. And we did a similar idea of getting the students to think in terms of creating policy and making recommendations rather than just doing what students usually do, which is to describe a factual situation or describe a series of laws or cases.
Yeah. I try the same thing, and one of the challenges that I normally face is how to grade them. Then, right? It's very difficult if you ask them to do precise policy recommendations. There are many factors which are not purely legal in the sense of that you can tell them this is right or wrong, right? So it's getting, in my view, a little bit more difficult to give them proper grades. Would you share this experience, and if so, how do you deal with it?
I hope they're not watching.
They might, you know.
but my thought is at this time, with all the difficulties, compassion is very important, and that we should grade generously.
Yeah, certainly we should, but at the same time, we should also grade them in a justifiable way. And I think
Correct.
this is challenging. It's not impossible, but it's challenging.
Right.
Let's talk, if I may ask you that, a little bit more about the topic. So I mean, as we said before, COVID law has health law and public health law implications, but it also has some other aspects. For example, labor law or tax law or bankruptcy law. Would you try to cover those subjects as well, or are you purely talking about health-related matters there?
So during the pandemic, a group of us, I was incredibly honored to join some of the best public health scholars in the country, including Scott Burris and Lance Gable and Wendy Parmet. And we, with some other colleagues, wrote 2 long reports on COVID law. The first one we got out in August of 2020. The second we got out just after the new administration took office in the United States, so in March 21. And we were able to convince some of the great academic scholars in health law and public health law to write chapters for these reports. And they're about 250 pages each. And one of the challenges was exactly what you say, which is how do you define the scope? What are the issues? And the way that we conceptualized it was we divided the report into several broad topics. So, for example, the first broad topic was using government powers to control the pandemic. The second, which is going to differ very much depending upon the country you're in, is how you fulfill those government responsibilities in a federal system and the issues that can arise. Thirdly, we looked at financing and delivering healthcare. Fourthly, we looked at access to medicines, medical supplies, PPE, rationing, things like that. To go directly to your question as to whether we would include labor law, we looked at protecting workers and their families. And then probably the most challenging part, and the part that evolved during 2021, particularly in the United States, was how we tackled disparities and health equity, both during the pandemic and thereafter. And so we divided the subject up into those areas, and for each of those areas, we have about 5 or 6 chapters going into particular detail.
Which brings me back to the question that I had before, because you said rightly that students are enthusiastic about the subject. On the other hand, my perception of many of the legal professionals in the domain, and also of some students, is that when it comes to health-related, COVID-related matters, law, at least in Europe or at least in Austria, is in some kind of a crisis. I think you get rather exhausted by seeing how little impact all those legal theories that you develop and all those legal arguments that you develop have on the political decision making on a daily basis, and also on the opinion of the public. So do you think that your students remain enthusiastic also after the class and after a year or two, or will they be a little bit more exhausted and depressed and start studying something more useful than law afterwards?
Well, as I always tell my health law students, if you can understand and analyze health law, you can deal with so many other topics. So I think if you can if you can understand why particular regulations from the Biden administration are being either struck down by the courts or upheld by the courts. You know, it was 2 weeks ago that with my class, we were able to go through 2 Supreme Court opinions, right? One dealing with the mandate for medical workers, which was upheld, and the other one dealing with a general mandate for all businesses, which was stayed, which was predicted to go down. So to be able to sit there and look at those 2 cases decided on the same day, and to look at the text, to look at the reasoning of the courts, and to look at the dissents from the more conservative members, which perhaps project into what might happen in the future. Those I thought were very valuable exercises. That would be done in just about any class. So I think there are things that are far beyond the law of COVID, the skills and the text that we look at that will serve the students well going forward. I think there are major questions of federalism that have been raised. I mean, I know Austria is a federal state. Have your Landers.
Landeshauptmann or Hauptfrau, yeah. So the head of region,
Germany does. France has its region. I mean, all of us have to deal with these sort of federal questions, and it's been absolutely fascinating to see different levels of government asserting control or refusing to assert control as we go through this. And these are questions of state and federal constitutional law. There are also questions about, as we've seen in some states, you only have to look as far as Florida, for example, at the moment, where you see the state government is trying to impose its will on local governments and school boards. And those are being fought out in sort of a mini or a micro federalism mirror to the major federalism issues. So I think these are all incredibly important questions going forward.
Absolutely. But interestingly, in my view, at least, they are also political. They are not just legal, right? And there might be a more serious distinction here in Europe, at least in continental Europe, between political issues and purely legal issues. And COVID makes it very difficult to draw this distinction, right? Because a lot of what we are saying on the legal side is at the same time also a political argument, and vice versa. And the US might have less problems in the interplay between those two, right? So for example, it would not be a proper legal analysis here in Austria to try to identify Supreme Court judges in their political background and try to highlight then whether this has an impact on what they are doing. That would clearly not be a standard legal argument.
Right.
It is in the US in some ways, and that's probably a difference that is important when it comes to the analysis of COVID as well, right? Because we would be very fine in Europe to say federalism has A, B, C, D legal issues, but we would probably not in a standard legal debate tell people, okay, but at the same time, this has this or that political outcome, right? And that might explain the exhaustion of some of our students.
So I think it's interesting that you say how maybe Europe has, or some European countries are in a legal crisis about COVID. What is absolutely clear is that in the United States, we are in a political crisis. We are in a political crisis about COVID, and we are in a political crisis of which COVID and how we deal with it is merely a symptom. We are in a very, very dangerous time. Yeah.
Every US American I'm talking to tells me the same story. It's really, really very serious. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. And do you talk about that with your students? Is this part of your teaching experience?
So this is where one has to be very careful, and one has to be balanced. One has to recognize that where one teaches, if you taught in California, you would probably have a different group of students, a different political mindset in the classroom from perhaps if you teach in Mississippi or if you teach where I am in Indiana. And so you have to be a little more balanced. You have to try and see both sides. You have to be careful with your personal opinions. And you have to be careful with the language you use, so as not to offend. But equally, I exercise the right of an academic to have a view and to argue that view. But I do try and put both sides forward, where at least the other side is cogent. I'm not dealing politely or constructively with misinformation and the nonsense that comes out of the mouths of so many of the people against vaccines and so on.
Yeah. So I think things are very difficult here because you rightly said that you need to be careful. Although I would be very interested, by the way, what you mean by careful and in how far this is some kind of self-censorship here. But you can't be careful in some ways, right? I mean, wearing mask or not, or vaccinating or not, this is not, at least in my view, this is nothing where you can be careful, right? Because you have a standpoint on this and you make your argument and that's it, right? So what exactly is being careful then in this situation? Is it accepting that other people are of a different, or might be of a different opinion? But again, this has legal implications, doesn't it? I mean, if you are of the opinion that vaccines don't work, it will be very difficult to tell people that there is an obligation to get vaccinated, right? So you need to go to the substance of the argument and without being careful.
So, but you would avoid, I know you would also avoid this. You would not simply say, you must go get vaccinated. I am right, you are wrong.
As a student, no, right. But I would probably make the argument. I would make the argument. It's from a constitutional point of view, okay, to introduce an obligation to get vaccinated, provided that the vaccine does any good to the general public, which is the case in this case. Period.
Right. And then you bring forward the evidence showing the scientific basis for that. Indeed. Both as to the vaccine and the diagrams that we show in my COVID class about, what the hospital populations look like when they have been vaccinated or where they haven't been vaccinated. I mean, this is startling stuff. And I think it's appropriate. I don't think there are arguments about many of those things.
Yeah, but there are people who do argue about that. They are probably not sitting in your class, I would assume, but they might sit somewhere in a political body, right? And this is probably part of the crisis you are talking about, right? And that makes it very difficult, in my view, to I mean, personally, I must say, I don't know any longer what being careful in this situation as a teacher really means, right? And I would really appreciate your input on this, what it means for you.
I don't have any golden rules. I just know that frequently I silently count inside my mind 1, 2, 3, and then I answer. Right?
Okay.
But I think as a health law teacher, this is not new for me. Right? And when you think about the topics that you would guess that I would teach in my health law classes, I teach abortion law. I teach death and dying and assisted suicide. I teach American-style healthcare finance, which leaves uninsured millions of people. And all of those are part of the political discourse, which is okay and is manageable. But for the last 20 or 30 years in the United States, they've become part of our culture wars.
Mm.
And culture wars are sadder, have more casualties, and are much harder to navigate. That's the great sadness. As someone who loves the United States, I was not brought up in the United States. I moved there when I was in my 20s, and fell in love with the country and its ideals. And so it's very sad for me to see these kinds of developments.
Yeah. And what is really striking for me in this is that, I mean, abortion and how the health system is financed and so on, those are, I mean, you can be of different opinions there, but at least you have some kind, or you had some kind of common basis about the facts on which you are then building up the legal argument. And what it has been happening now in the last years, and in particular in COVID, in my view, is that there is no longer any kind of basic agreement about the facts. It's not just the legal argument. It starts really from the basic point, which is, what do we see here, right? What is this? And that's new. And I think it's very terrifying because in the US, it's probably even worse than in Europe, but it's also in Europe very dominant now, in particular in COVID. So COVID is again a point where you can see these developments in a very, very clear way before they are in all the other parts of the society. And I'm a little bit frightened by this. Yeah. And
so my great friend and collaborator, Professor Wendy Parmet, who's at Northeastern University in Boston, wrote a wonderful article, which is called "The First Post-Truth Pandemic." And the idea that COVID was the first pandemic that we've had to deal with misinformation, not just perhaps bad information. And next week in my COVID class, we will be talking about information and misinformation.
Yeah.
So we'll be looking at how, if possible, you control misinformation, whether you can counter misinformation with better information. We will also, in that module, also look at the deficiencies in the American public health data system, with regard to data collection, data management, many of the things I know that you professionally you are very interested in. Including obviously privacy issues. So very much looking forward to talking about data management, data systems, but also looking at this very difficult question of misinformation. And I'm sure all of your listeners and viewers who are fans of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell will understand what's going on in America at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting to hear from you that this data issue is also a topic in your class and not just in mine, because Europeans and Austrians have the tendency to believe that that the problem is very, very terrible here, but it's not the only country where it's bad. Let me share this perspective. Wonderful. If I may, one very last question, Nick, if I may, which is this opioid crisis topic and the COVID crisis related perspectives that this has. I learned from you with very big interest that those two things are interrelated, so they are not diverse, right? They are connected with each other. And this makes it so interesting to me to see into this opioid topic from a COVID perspective. Could you help me and help us in finding this interplay very precisely and thinking about what that might mean in the future?
Well, I think we start from sort of the mental image of the Venn diagram, in which in the United States at the moment, we have three concurrent public health emergencies. We have COVID-19, we have opioid deaths and overdoses and diseases, and we have institutionalized racism. And those are all public health emergencies. The last one, obviously, being a product of a lack of health equity and health disparities, as well as explicit and implicit discrimination. And those all feed into each other. COVID exposed questions about health equity and health disparities, right? We, as the lucky ones, the more affluent people who had nice homes and home studios where we could stay during COVID, we exploited to a large extent the poor, the persons of color, which is another Venn diagram, who are the people that keep the country running, right? Who deliver our groceries during a pandemic. In my case, who deliver our wine, even Austrian wine. And we expect and collect our garbage, our trash, right? All of those poorly paid persons we labeled as essential, and therefore they had to keep working outside while we got to stay home and safe. With regard to the intersection between people who use drugs and COVID, we both spent more time talking about COVID than we were talking about opioids. We perhaps forgot the kind of condition that persons who use drugs and the Venn diagram they have with homeless people, what happens to them during a pandemic. And we forgot perhaps how a lot of the lives of people who use drugs depend upon peers and meetings and socialization to try and help them through their problems. And suddenly we cut them off from that because we locked down and so forth. On the other hand, things that we had been doing poorly, in my opinion, with regard to opioid use, actually got a little bit better during the pandemic because of changes in laws and policies. So, for example, in the US, we have been quite reticent to use telemedicine in treating people who use drugs. And during lockdown, the federal government passed a waiver allowing much more virtual treatment, even telephone treatment, and from a broader range of physicians. One of the problems we've had with regard to opioid use is that we asked physicians in this country to take special tests and special qualifications, so that's changing a bit, with regard to using certain drugs. We also typically in this country, by law, only allow the use of methadone as a treatment for opioid use disorder in a specialized methadone clinic. That means we force people who use drugs to go to these clinics, people who, again, my Venn diagram, maybe don't have good transport, right? They don't have time off work because they're essential. And so one of the things that the federal government did was it allowed home delivery of those drugs during the pandemic. And so we got a chance to see some natural experiments as we change things around, like telemedicine and drug access and so on and so forth. So those are interesting pointers and things that we take going forward. But at the same time, and tragically, the year of COVID last year saw the largest ever number of deaths from overdoses in the United States, over 100,000.
It's unbelievable. I mean, the figure is unbelievable. Yeah.
And we simply, going to both law and policy, we have maintained a criminalization and carceration approach to people who use drugs, which has been prevalent now for 40 years or more in this country. We still treat people who use drugs as persons with a moral defect, and therefore persons who should be subject to the criminal law. What we don't do is say, this is no different in substance from diabetes or any other chronic disease. And we should treat these persons like that and increase access to healthcare, increase the types of treatment. We still, as a country, the United States, we still do not treat persons who use drugs or with mental illness, both of which tend to intersect as well. We do not treat them with the same level of care as we treat other clinical symptoms. It's the problem in health law that we call health parity. And we still fail in that. So there is much work to be done. We have an exciting project that I'm working on now with Scott Burris, who's at Temple Law in Philadelphia, and his team. And we're very grateful that we just received some funding to do that work. And I think I'm going to be kind of busy for the next couple of years.
I think so too, yeah. But just one last question. Do you think that there is now a pushback coming again when it comes to these positive tendencies that you mentioned last year, that show online medical services and all this, so people getting their pills home, etc.? Is this going to stay? Or do you see that it's going away again with the next, or even this wave of the pandemic, possibly?
So I think as we're still under a federal emergency declaration, so that keeps alive these waivers or exceptions or guidances. Those are going to come to an end soon. Also coming to an end soon will be reimbursement for some of these telemedicine.
Okay.
It's not just for people who use drugs, but telemedicine more broadly, which has been very popular during the pandemic. So these are questions of, again, of politics. They're questions of reimbursement. They're questions of finance. We have hospitals that are big businesses. How much of their income depends not just on treatment that if you were a doctor, we could be doing here, but also on how they get back the investment they've made in their bricks and mortar offices. I mean, they have income from parking. If we do this online, they lack that, and so on. They rent out rooms like a hotel, really, don't they? So do they have the incentive to keep telemedicine going? I think that's a really difficult question going forward, both to ask government and also to ask private industry, which essentially runs our healthcare system.
Yeah, and there's not too much reason to be too optimistic in this then, right? I would say, right? Let's see.
We're alive, we're healthy, we're optimistic.
Yeah, we need to. Yeah, certainly. Nicolas, thank you so much for this, for these 50 minutes. It was really a mind-blowing experience. I very much appreciate this. Thank you for having the time to share your views with us. All the best for this research project that looks really interesting from the outside. I do hope that we stay in touch. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to all of you who listen to us. Stay connected, stay interested, and in particular, stay healthy or become healthy as possible, as quickly as possible. All the best to all of you. Bye-bye. Thank you.